This is Rough Drafts Welcome,
the podcast where you can mess up, and we can too.
I'm Sachiko.
And I'm Erin.
And together with the editors at Salt and Sage Books,
we're changing the face of storytelling, one rough draft at a time.
On today's
we're glad you're here.
Of Rough
Let's
Drafts
get started.
Welcome. I'm excited to sit down and talk with you today. As I am recording this, I have one of those little fireplace backgrounds on my computer screen. So I'm imagining that all of us are just gathering around. We're going to be kind of cozy, wrap up in something warm, and we're going to have a conversation. I want to talk to you today about punching up versus punching down, specifically within fiction, and even more specifically, how you can use your knowledge of punching up and punching down to lean into humor in your piece, but also how you can use your awareness of this to make some really compelling villains and interesting antagonists as well. So we're going to talk about all of that. First, I want to tell you a little story of how this whole idea showed up for me, because there's always a story, right? There's always a story. So I was driving with my nibblings, and this was a while ago, and one of them started to tell your mom jokes. If you are in the United States or have been in any elementary school in the United States, or near children who have been in an elementary school, you have probably heard the your mama jokes, right? And for some particular reason, the way that they were telling this joke, just in the back of the car, they're being funny. I genuinely think that they mean no harm by it. And they did a, your mama is so fat, blah, 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 blah. I don't remember what the punchline was, because I don't care and I don't actually find it very funny. And it was 2 or 3 jokes like that in a row. And I started to feel upset. And children are not responsible for my emotional reactions. So I took a little bit of time and thought through, like, okay, why is it that I'm feeling not okay about this? In the moment, I was like, ooh, I don't think that that's very funny. I don't think it's funny to make fat people the butt of your joke, and I don't think it's very funny to make moms the butt of your joke either. Can you please tell a different joke? And they were willing, they shifted, but it took me a little while to figure out what it was about that particular joke that bothered me so much. And what it came down to is this conversation. So I'm essentially reenacting with you the conversation that I had with my nibblings about it later on. And they are such incredibly thoughtful and wonderful people. And I love them so much. I feel really lucky to know them, and even more lucky to be related to them. So this is a love letter to them. Love, Auntie Erin. So, all right, what we're going to talk about is punching up versus punching down, right? So in order to understand what punching up and punching down is, and I promise we will tie this into writing. I promise we will get there. So in order to understand punching up or punching down, we need to discuss systems of power. So this is specifically about in the United States. I do not have enough cultural awareness to speak to this about other parts of the world. But in the United States, we have systems of power where someone is on top, and therefore, by necessity, someone is on the bottom. So if ever there is a situation where one person is higher than, that means that someone else is necessarily on the bottom. And you could think of it like as a triangle, if that helps the visualization. For these particular ones, think of it just like as a line, right? It's a continuum. And at least in the United States, under the system that we are currently operating in, this late stage capitalistic hellscape, there is a continuum of power and influence. So let's say that the continuum goes from bottom up, because then the punching up and punching down will become clearer, and why we use those specific terms. So first, let's talk about wealth. All right. If you had just 2 random people, you plucked 2 random people in the United States and put them up on a stage, one of them is going to probably be wealthier than the other. So I want you to imagine that they are in a bank. All right. So in a bank, the person who is wealthy has more power. They literally have more spending power. They have more power to control where they are located. They have more power to control what food they eat, the places that they visit, the cultural experiences that they have. Wealth is a privilege. Wealth also puts them at the top of this power structure. Yeah? You're with me so far. If you were all here, I would ask you to please nod. So wealth, and you're going to hear me use the words power and privilege kind of interchangeably here. And I don't know if that is 100% accurate, but for this particular discussion, I feel like it's a kind of one-to-one comparison. So wealth is one system of power that we have in the United States specifically. So people who are wealthy are more powerful than people who are poor. And then you have people who are middle class, we're going to put that in quotes, who are more in the middle of the power range, right? They might have more mobility. They might have more accessibility to medicine, to good healthcare, to good schools, things like that. And good schools, man, we could go on a whole rant about that. I think that's such a misnomer, but good schools, okay? Schools that happen to be funded by the property taxes of the people around them. So if you live in a wealthy neighborhood, you are more likely to have a better funded school. Okay. Ooh, man, this is just going to be me going off on a little series of rants with every single one of these, isn't it? It might be. Strap in. It's going to be a good one. So wealth is one system of power. If you have someone who is wealthy, who says something crummy about someone who is poor, that is punching down, right? Because they have the power and they are mocking people who have less power than they do. That is called punching down. All right. This is why when politicians make comments about welfare queens, this is punching down. Okay. And punching down, in my mind, is incredibly inappropriate. And it usually comes with some form of racism or sexism or homophobia or ableism attached to it, which we'll get into that more later. So it is not the same thing for a wealthy person to make fun of a poor person as it is for a poor person to make fun of a wealthy person. Do you see what I mean? One of them exposes the power dynamic as what it is, and the other is people on top pushing down. Punching down, never appropriate. Punching up can be funny. It can be quite funny. And not that punching down, well, no, I don't think punching down is ever funny personally. And you can make a villain for sure. See, here's your writing tips. You can make a villain for sure to have somebody who is on the top of this system of power punching down. We will immediately dislike them because we understand that wealthy people have more power than people who are poor. We will immediately understand that. But if you have a poor person making fun of rich people, it's not the same thing. So when I see people saying, eat the rich, I'm just like, yeah, eat the rich, man. I agree with you because you are punching up. But if I see wealthy CEOs saying, keep the minimum wage low, I'm over here like, you got to be kidding me. You got to be kidding me. You're already in a position of power. It's not fair for you to make us less powerful. It's not fair for people who are wealthy to take away from other people. You're going to get so much of my own political beliefs in this one too. I'm okay with it. All right. Another scale of power that we have in the United States, we've already done wealth. We also have whiteness. And inside of whiteness, there are a lot of subcategories here as well, because there is definitely some colorism that is inherent in this idea of whiteness as most privileged and blackness or brown-skinned people as less powerful, right? You just think of it like if you were pulled over by a police officer. If I am pulled over by a police officer, I am a white woman, and I am less likely to receive a ticket from the police than a black woman who is pulled over for the same offense, right? Because white people have more power in our society. And if I'm losing you, if you don't believe me, I really need you to go and look at records of incarceration. And just look at that. Just look at records of incarceration, specifically looking at nonviolent crime. And you will see that by and large, white people receive less consequence or lighter sentences, things along those lines. So whiteness is the power dynamic in our society. I think that we have done some work as a society over the last several years to try to bring more awareness to that. And I think it has done a lot of good in some cases. And then I think in other cases that there have been enough people at the top who simply haven't cared that real change hasn't happened yet in a lot of areas. And I want to be really clear here. I am putting the onus for change on people who are on the top of the power structure. It is, if you have power in a situation, I deeply believe that it is your civic responsibility and a human duty for you to be aware of the power that you have and then to use it to help equalize society. I feel like that is so important. And whether you agree or disagree with me on political stances, I think we can all agree that it is a lot easier for a billionaire CEO in a romance novel to affect real change than it is for the poor woman who he falls in love with to affect real change, right? We can acknowledge that those power structures exist. Okay, another one that we have is being a man. And I'm going to intentionally separate this from being cisgendered because I feel like they are slightly different topics. If you want a more in-depth look at this, you can find some really interesting conversations specifically by trans men who talk about the way that their privilege shifted as soon as they began to pass as a cis man. So men are at the top, women are at the bottom. Adults are at the top. Children are at the bottom. Being cisgendered is at the top. Being transgender is at the bottom. Being straight is at the top. Being any amount of queer is at the bottom. And again, there's like a continuum, right? There's a continuum within this. And if you're part of these communities in the more, like, I'm thinking specifically about the idea of straight as the most powerful. And I guess you could even say it's the most respected by society as a whole. By the society that we live in, being straight is more respected than being queer. There are also people who will talk about, like, for example, I am bisexual, but I am married to a man. That does not mean that my bisexuality is any less valid, but it does mean that to a stranger, I present as straight. And I've had more than one conversation because I have pins like all over my bag and my notebooks and my coffee cup and my laptop and everything that specifically are like about queer pride. And I have had people completely change their tune when they realize that I am queer. And I hate that. And to be absolutely clear, I want to own that, like, this is one of the only places where I am marginalized. I am a woman and I am queer. And I mean, that's really all of the privilege that I have. Those are the places where I am injured regularly by the system. And I want to acknowledge that I still have an incredibly large amount of privilege and power simply because of the way that the system is built, not because I have done anything necessarily to deserve it. But that's partly why Salt and Sage even exists. That's partly why we're doing this podcast, is I feel like it's really important for me as a person who has the things that I have to do something about it and to speak up loudly about the injustices that are happening in our society as a whole. I think that's really important. So I promise I'm not asking you to do anything that I'm not doing myself. All right. We've already talked about those things. So we also have being able-bodied versus being, I'm going to use the word disabled, differently able. Again, there is such a wide continuum there. And yes, there's just such a wide continuum. We also have thinness and what appears to be physical health higher than being fat, or what appears to be unhealthy. We're going to put that in quote marks. And then we also have people who are thin with muscles are higher up on the list than people who are thin without muscles. Like, again, there is such a continuum. We also have Christianity, at least in the United States, is the privileged position, and the other religions that are existing in the United States, even if they are more popular in the global majority, they are looked at as less than. They are taken less seriously. Their convictions are taken less seriously. or they are mocked. Okay, so with all of these things, there are so many other ones that we could talk about. I tried to make a quick list that wasn't going to take me the entire half hour to go through. We've already spent like half of the podcast even just identifying what they are. So I'm going to assume that you understand and you're with me, you agree with me that we do have systems of power, right, in the United States. So those things are on the top. So if you happen to be a cisgendered white man who is relatively thin, who is a Christian, and who is fairly wealthy, you are going to be at the top of most of these power structures. I forgot to say if you're straight. You're going to be at the top of most of these power structures. And it is therefore really, really, really easy for us to say, oh, you know what? I'm going to have that man be my villain. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with this. So we're trying to kind of switch gears here over to writing. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with having someone who is at the top of all of the power structures be your villain or be your antagonist. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between the two of those. But I do think that you can come into some very tricky implications if you are not aware that this is why they are your villain. So if a boss, for example, if we're telling the point, oh my goodness, how do we explain this? All right, so imagine that we have a story where a barista and the CEO of the coffee company fall in love, right? Let's have that be our story. We have several different issues of power dynamics here, right? If the CEO says anything that is even remotely critical of the other people who are under, we'll make it a man, who are under him in the business, he is immediately punching down and he is a villain. However, if we have the fellow baristas talking to our heroine and saying like, I cannot believe you would date him, he is such a da 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 da. If we are calling him names, it does not feel the same because they are punching up. Okay. And again, suppose the argument that I can hear, that I can imagine people having with this is that we don't want to have anybody be punching any way or the other. We would like to just get rid of that violence altogether and have things just be nice and straightforward and have everybody be kind. And I think that is a beautiful world to move towards and to have as a goal. But I also think that if you want to address real societal issues, then it is important to be aware that people who are being stepped on probably don't like being stepped on. Unless there is active consent happening, where this is a thing where they actually have choice in the matter, then it is not an issue of politeness, nor is it an issue of morality. It is simply an issue of surviving. Yeah? So punching up, very, very, very different than punching down. You can easily make somebody a villain by having them punching down. If you have, for example, let's do a queer woman and maybe she is fairly wealthy because she's inherited some money from her family and she is incredibly cruel to her employees who are not Christian. We don't like her. She is punching down, right? And whether or not you have, we have the intersection of all these different things, right? She could be at the bottom of the power dynamic when it comes to men and women, right? And again, I'm aware that there are more genders, but for this particular example, I feel like it's important to note that. And actually, even people who are non-binary are probably considered below women in this particular, in this particular power structure, because then you also see women who mock people who are non-binary or gender non-conforming or genderqueer because they are above them in power. And so they can do that. And the way that you maintain power in a system that is as broken as ours is that you punch down. You are constantly trying to step on the people who are under you. And it becomes a dangerous thing for the power structure if people come together and are willing to kind of topple the power structure and the top bit. We saw this a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit in the the first wave of feminism. And I'm not a feminist historian. I'm aware that my understanding is piecemeal at best. I'm working on addressing that, but there are a lot of books to read and a lot of theory to understand. And I am just starting now, really. Well, not like right now. I've been trying for a while. Anyway, my point is that when women as a whole and non-binary people, like if they were to band together and say, we're not okay with this structure with where men are on the top, they have the manpower to be able to make real systemic change. But you have to have everybody on board with it, right? So I'm totally going off topic, but it's fine. One of the things that really frustrates me about feminism, specifically in the religion where I grew up. So I'm talking about the intersection here of Christianity and feminism, right? And I really would hope that there are Christian denominations out there who do it better. But the way that it showed up in the church that I was raised in is that women worked really hard to get closer to the men who were in power so that they would have some semblance of power. It's, I believe it's called proximity to power. And this is why you see women who are also misogynistic. Women who say things like, oh, I don't really like other girls. Like the whole pick me idea is a woman who is trying to be close to the people in power. And it's a survival tactic. I can understand it from that point of view, but I think it makes me sad. Because at a certain point, you have to accept that you have less power. And I think at a certain level, you have to kind of be okay with it, or at least feel like there is nothing that you can do to address it. At a certain point, like in order to try to move yourself closer to that position of power, I think you have to, at a certain point, feel like you can't do anything about it. And moving from that place of powerlessness, I do not think is a choice. I think it is a matter of survival. So we see this or I see it, I have seen it personally too, with the desire that I had as a teenager to not be queer. I really wanted to be straight because I knew that being queer was going to get me in trouble, specifically with the church that I was in, but also with the people who I was around. Because of that society, I wanted to be straight so bad, and I just wasn't. And I really felt for a long time like it was a failing of who I was instead of me trying really hard to survive. And I feel like that's a much more compassionate way to look at it, that you've tried really hard to get as close to power as you could so that you would be protected and that you would be safe. Okay, this has gone right off the rails away from writing. So let's bring it back and we'll talk about how I would personally use this to create antagonists. So a villain in my mind is someone who everything that they do, we can all agree, they are not making good choices. We do not like them. Period. They are not a good person. There is no redemption in them. There's none of this morally gray villainy. I feel like villains as a whole have become a lot more nuanced in the media in the last, 15, 20 years. We don't see so much anymore like, oh, this person is just a bad guy. We see a lot more of like their backstory and we understand them a little better. And then that can help us empathize with them to a certain point. So a villain for me is someone who is at the top of at least one particular power structure, and they are happy with it. All right? Now, I'm aware that that is a controversial thing to say, but I think that at a certain point, if you are okay with punching down, if you are okay with the fact that you are on top while other people struggle, I think there is some villainy inherent in that. If we want to switch and talk about antagonists are simply forces that make it difficult for your character to do what they want to do, right? So you can have, if we were using these particular power structures, right? We can have an antagonist who is, say that we have a Muslim character and we have a Christian character. They might be friends, but the Christian character could serve as an antagonist for our Muslim character or vice versa, where they are blocking each other when it comes to things about faith, right? Or we could have a thin character and we can have a fat character, and they might be best friends. They might get along so well, but occasionally the thin character says something that is just not great, that is fat phobic. And then they become an antagonist. It becomes this point of friction between the friends, where even if this character, this thin character, even if they do it unknowingly, they are still operating through this system of power, right? They are still moving through, oh, well, actually, I'm better than you. Well, actually, I have more power than you do. And I understand why we do that. Again, I really do think it's a survival mechanism. And so it takes a lot of conscious and intentional practice and thought and work to unpick why you feel like you deserve to be safe and why you feel like, therefore, other people deserve to not feel safe. Because the two things are inherently combined. There is this quote that says, we are not, oh golly, I want to quote it exactly, so I'm going to find it. Give me just a second here. The gist of it is that we are not, goodness gracious. Sorry, you're just going to have to give me a minute. Okay, it's Maya Angelou. Of course it is. She says, the truth is, no one of us can be free until everybody is free. And that is, I feel like that is the crux of it. And I also feel like there is so much really interesting story there. And I'm not even saying that your stories have to all include somebody who is like, okay, we're going to look at the power dynamic here and we're going to figure out the power dynamic. And then one character is finally going to realize that like they have the power to make a change, and then they make a change, and then things are so much better for everybody around them. You could do that. I would read it. But I'm not saying you have to do that. You can have characters who do not change over the course of the book. You can have characters who are an antagonist the entire time. You can have villains who don't change. I would say that by definition, a villain is someone who does not change. They do not change. And our hero is the one who goes through that arc. They come out of the other side knowing something that they did not know before. Now, am I saying that we desperately need more stories about white men who suddenly realize that they're in positions of privilege and power and they do something about it? I don't know. I feel like that market is a little heavy right now. But even reading the readings that I have been doing recently, a lot of the male characters do a lot of lip service, but they don't actually do a lot of action. The things that they're actually doing don't necessarily match what they are saying. And again, this doesn't have to just be men. I'm kind of leaning on this heavily because I had a therapy session yesterday all about the patriarchy and how I really feel let down by it. And all of these men in my life who were in a position to change things. And when I told them, hey, this isn't great, I feel like you care about me. Listen, here is the problem. You can fix this. I know you can fix this. How many of them essentially just patted me on the head and told me to go back to being a good little girl and stop sticking my nose where it didn't belong. That's where I'm moving from with this. And I think if our goal as writers is to reflect the society that we live in, even to any extent, you can be writing about dragons and you can still talk about power structures. You can be writing about mermaids and for children even, and you can still talk about power structures. And this is not to say that every single book that you write has to have like an overt message of like, oh, we're going to fight the power. That's not what I'm saying either. I am saying that when you are thinking about creating a world, it's important to consider power structures. And that as you are creating characters, it is important to consider power structures and how they all fit together. I think that this really can help you write effective villains. I think it can help you write effective antagonists. And, oh man, I'm suddenly thinking of a book I read where these two girls were like best friends, but then one girl, because of her position, she was given the chance to either move up in society or stay with her friend, and she chose to move up. And that betrayal, so this is an act of survival, right? By this best friend. She knew that if she chose her best friend, that they would both be kicked out, and it would be this whole thing, and that her life would be incredibly difficult. And so she chose to move up into this additional position of power. Again, as a survival mechanism. I understand it as a survival mechanism. That said, that doesn't mean that her friend did not feel that betrayal deeply, and that it did not shape her, and that it did not shape both of them. So, okay, big takeaways. If you are bothered by poor people making fun of wealthy people, if you are bothered by women calling out men, if you are bothered by queer people calling out straight culture, please remember that they are punching up. They are saying, here's the system that I am being forced to live under. I do not have very much control or power to change it. The way that I can address it is through humor and is through punching up. You'll see this a lot in the news too, where you will have, I'm thinking of a specific article that I read the other day about how grocery prices are massively inflated because of theft. Like, that's why we're increasing the grocery prices. But then when you compare it to their actual numbers of like the profit, they have all of these grocery chains who are talking about, oh, retail theft has gone way up. That might be true. That might be true. But if you look at their actual profit numbers, they have all had like record-breaking profits year over year over year over year for years. So there is always more to the story. And especially when it comes to, I think we can safely say, politicians, business owners. I'm including myself in this as a business owner. Politicians, business owners, people who are wealthy, people who have any amount of power. They are so incredibly invested in remaining in power. Again, I think as a survival mechanism. I really think it's a survival mechanism because they might even be fully aware of what life is like on the other side of their power dynamic, and they don't want to go there. They don't want to go there. So, but they're okay with other people being there. Do you see what I mean? Do you see what I mean? Like, it's a real catch-22. And I'm not in the least trying to excuse people who are benefiting from these power structures. I don't think that is not my intention. That is not my goal. But if you think about it, like as a character motivation, I understand that it is a bid for safety. The problem becomes when we are so focused on our safety that we forget about the safety of humanity. And we forget about the impact that we can have as a whole. And I feel like that strikes at the core message of why I am a writer, is because I feel like one person, one writer, one book, one story, one character can have a ripple effect that we don't fully comprehend as writers. I think if I were to ask any one of you to think of a book that completely changed the way that you saw the world, you could probably all name a book or two or three or 100. Those things exist because writers, creators, editors, filmmakers, script writers, podcast producers, like you, individual people, thought, I have something to say about this, and I'm going to say it loudly. And there is so much power in us willingly doing that. I think it's hard work. Sometimes it can feel really uncomfortable. And that's okay. That's okay. Learning should feel hard, or you're not learning anything new, right? Okay, so let's summarize. Systems of power. There are systems of power that exist in the United States. There simply are. And there are people on the top, and therefore there are people on the bottom. People who are on the top, if they do not care about the people underneath them, pretty easy to cast them as a villain. You can do a variety of intersections to create a villain. In the same way that, oh gosh, you remember when I was talking about the mafia romances, that the key was that there was one particular rule he would not break for himself. It is because in one particular, like the example that I gave, like this one guy would never hurt a child. In his power structures, he is on the top in every single one of those power structures, except for the one where adults are on top and children are on the bottom. He has equalized those two power structures, or leveled it out, in that he values a child's life as much as he values his own. And that is why then we're like, oh, but he has a heart of gold. He probably doesn't actually have a heart of gold. He's a mafia overlord. Anyway, but it gives us space to care about them as a character because they have some sort of self-awareness. And I think, yeah, it becomes so interesting to think about how you are creating your characters in terms of power structures, because I really do think that every human, what our brain wants more than anything is to keep us safe. Keep us safe and have us belong. And if those two things are met by maintaining the power structure, I mean, of course we do it. Of course we do it. Again, not to say that there aren't people who do it horribly. We are not a fan of billionaires on this account. Yada, yada. Alrighty. I really don't know how to wrap this one up. So I guess we will just say that I hope that this was helpful. I would be very curious to hear your thoughts and comments about this one if you want to tappy into the comment section, or you can always go to our blog and give us comments there. We really genuinely like hearing what you're thinking about the podcast and how things are going. And as always, I want to acknowledge that I only know what I know. I am aware that I have big gaps in my understanding and in my education, and I am working to fill those as quickly as I possibly can. But yeah, if I have missed something, I would really love for you to tell me about it, genuinely, because we don't know what we don't know, right? We don't know what we don't know. And the only way that we can learn more of those things is to be willing to be uncomfortable enough to learn. If we can be willing to be uncomfortable in our lack of knowledge, then I think we will be really surprised the things that we can learn and understand. Yeah, so please stop telling your mama's so fat jokes. I don't like them because women are at the bottom and fat people are at the bottom. Don't make those jokes. They're not actually funny. They're only humor at the expense of the people at the bottom of the power structures, and that's not actually funny. It's just abusive. Alrighty. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
This has been Rough Drafts Welcome.
Thank you so much for listening.
Got any questions? We would love to hear them. Got a complaint? We'll hear it too.
Yep. Leave us a 5-star review. Pretty please. And thank you. And if you want to book with Salt and Sage Books or learn anything else about what we do, or if you want to work with us or take our courses or blah, 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 you can find us at www.saltandsagebooks.com. And we're all over social media too.
We sure are.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.